Welcome to Just Relationships, the show that offers you concrete ways to make your relationships better. Whether it's your boss, your spouse, your children, or your friends, the quality of your relationships in life directly affects how you feel about yourself and the success you achieve. Your host, Dr. Duffy Spencer, a psychotherapist, telecoach, author, and seminar leader, will interview top experts to help you learn to manage this essential part of your life. And now, here's your host, Dr. Duffy Spencer.
Maybe you should talk to someone. Has anyone ever said that to you? What do you think? Maybe should you talk to someone? What on earth does that mean? Well, we are going to find out because I am so thrilled to introduce to you best-selling author Laurie Gottlieb. And yes, that is the name of her book. Maybe you should talk to someone. So it is so important this book is groundbreaking. It's the first of its kind, I believe, that is written for both professional audiences and lay audiences, and we'll talk more about it. But it is groundbreaking, and welcome, Laurie Gottlieb.
Oh, thank you. It's such a pleasure to have this conversation with you.
So what we're looking at here is you as a psychotherapist with a very rich history of storytelling and medical school and journalism, decided you wanted to help people. And then you became a psychotherapist. And I have to say, Laurie, that from the very beginning, in working with you and corresponding, it was, "Hi, I'm Laurie. Hi, Duffy." It was so different from the usual professional mode of talking to each other. And I found it so refreshing. So just to catch everyone up, maybe you should talk to someone is about Laurie talking about her own history, her own crises, her going to therapy herself, and incorporating that in, I believe it's 4 case studies, 4 different clients of hers with all different backgrounds and how she helped them. And as a psychotherapist myself and someone who is also in therapy, and this is the first time I've said this publicly, Laurie, thanks to you, I am absolutely fascinated with your book, your material. Again, groundbreaking.
Well, thank you. I'm so glad that you said that you're in therapy, because when the book came out, it was interesting. One of the things I really want to do is take away the stigma from getting help and making sure that people are valuing their emotional health. So, often we devalue anything that goes on with us emotionally, so we kind of minimize it. So, like, for example, if you broke your arm, you wouldn't say, well, I'm not going to go get that checked out because somebody else has cancer, so I really don't have it that bad. But if we feel anxious or sad or we can't sleep or we're having a relational difficulty or whatever it is, we say, well, it's not really that bad, right? And then people don't land in my office until they're having the equivalent of, let's say, an emotional heart attack. And at that point, they've suffered unnecessarily for so long. And it's harder to treat at that point because they didn't come at the point where it would have been, here's the beginning, here's what's happening. It got to a point where it got very bad. And so the fact that you said that you're in therapy, I remember when I did Terry Gross, and Terry Gross said to me right before we went on Fresh Air on NPR, she said, I don't know if I'm going to say this on the show, but I just want to let you know that I've been in therapy for years. And then she said it on the show, and every person that I did events with, whether that was, Katie Couric or other celebrities or whatever, they all said, I've never said this before publicly, but I'm going to tell people that I'm in therapy. So I'm so glad that's one of the results of this book.
And when people think, oh, well, you have arrived and you are in the position to help others. I've always described myself as a wounded healer, as many therapists do, because why do we go into this field? I just believe that we support others and we also need support.
Yeah, definitely. I don't really consider myself a wounded healer. I consider myself human. And so I think, again, there's that sort of stigma of if you struggle at any point in your life, you're somehow wounded. Whereas I think that's the essence of being human. You can't go through life and not at some point experience struggle. The question is, how do we deal with the struggle? And I think that's what's so transformative. And that's what I wanted to show in the book is it's not whether we're going to struggle, it's how we're going to get through it, how we're going to navigate it. And I wanted to show people navigating through those struggles in a way where they were growing, where it was hopeful, where it was inspiring. Because it's funny when people say to me, isn't it hard being a therapist, listening to all those depressing stories all day? And I say, that's not what my job is like at all. I think what I get to see is I get to see a metamorphosis of people who say, I need something to change. And I realize now that I have agency and I'm going to take responsibility for my life in a new way.
Yes. And thank you for that, Laurie. You already educated me. That's an old phrase. I hadn't really examined it. And the stigma of being wounded rather than struggling. That's a human condition to struggle, and we're all wounded in that degree. And then what do we do with it? And I'm reminded of that old story of the butterfly having to fight so hard to get out of the cocoon, and that gives it the strength to fly. So I think that people who have successfully dealt with struggles and hurts are much more resilient.
Yeah, I agree. I think when people come in, I'm always wondering, not just why are you here, but I want to know why now? Why this week, this month, did you call me when maybe this has been going on for a while? Because I'm looking for what's not working, but I'm also looking for strengths. I'm looking for what is working. And one thing that I always assess right away is their readiness to change. And so if they made that call, then something in them said, I'm ready for something different to happen in my life. And that is a strength. In addition to the patients that I follow throughout the book, I wanted to show myself in therapy too, not because I was wounded and not because these other people are wounded, but because we are all human. And I use my humanity in the room every day with patients. I don't mean that I bring my personal life into the room. I mean that I connect with people on a human level. And I think that that is an integral part, an integral ingredient in helping people to change.
Even though the stigma is less than it was historically, there is still stigma. When I describe to people, they ask me, how can people be in therapy so long? And I say it's really open to people who want to live on their growing edge, who are interested in self-reflection, self-awareness, expanding themselves, and being able to stay completely in present time. And one of my certifications is Gestalt therapy, and we talk about using ourselves as an instrument. And as not necessarily personal stories except where they're relevant, but just the humanness of it. So I also wanted to add to what you said that this is what happens too for me, that people come to me in crisis because they put off, as you say, they devalue their emotional health. It's not that important. And then I help them with the crisis and they get through it, and then they want to stop therapy. I advise them, why don't you stay and see what are some of the roots of this, how you got here in the first place, and how can you do some self-healing with my help.
I think that our goal is to help people so that they don't need us anymore. I think people come for different reasons. There are certainly people who come for the reasons that you said, where they really want to kind of explore and move to a different place in their lives. But I think the majority of people come to therapy because there is something that they want to work on, and there's some pattern that is keeping them stuck in their lives. And they don't necessarily know that there's a pattern yet. So it's like I talk, and maybe you should talk to someone about the difference between idiot compassion and wise compassion. And idiot compassion is what we do to our friends when they bring us a problem. So, our friend says, here's what happened with my partner or my boss or my sister or whatever, right? And we say, wow, they were terrible. You're right. They're wrong. We just back them up. Even though if you listen to your friend over time, they're probably telling you a very similar story, maybe different people or different circumstances, but it's kind of like if a fight breaks out in every bar you're going to, maybe it's you, because they keep sort of complaining about the same kind of thing, or they get into the same kind of conflict or situation. And in therapy, instead of offering idiot compassion, we offer wise compassion, where we hold up a mirror to people and we help them to see something about themselves that maybe they haven't been willing or able to do. And so when people come in, I always say I'm listening for the music under the lyrics. The lyrics are, here's the story, here's the thing that happened. The music is, what is the underlying struggle or pattern that got you into this situation in the first place? And that's what we usually work on in therapy. Of course, it helps with the lyrics. It helps with the problem that they came in with, but it helps them more broadly in their life because there's something that is keeping them stuck in some kind of pattern that's not working. But then I want them to leave, and I don't mean that I want them to leave, not that I don't,
yes.
that I don't enjoy working with them. It's that I want them to be able to take what they've learned about themselves from the experience of doing the work in therapy and then use that out in the world. Because we always say insight is the booby prize of therapy. You can have all the insight in the world, but if you're not making changes out in the world, the insight is useless. So if someone says, they come to therapy and they say, now I understand after last session why I keep getting into that argument with my partner. And I'll say, well, did you do something different? And they say, well, no, but now I understand why. So, okay, that's step one. But step two is, and now yes. What is your response? How is it going to be different? And eventually, they learn to navigate through the world more smoothly. And that's the goal, I think, of therapy, is to learn, what is tripping you up and how can you move through the world differently.
Yes, and sometimes it does take a while to identify those patterns, unearth them, look at the roots of them, how they got to develop that pattern in the first place. And in internal family systems, which I also am certified in, is thinking about the psyche as parts or subpersonalities and looking at some of these parts and showing compassion for them and how they develop these patterns initially as survival skills. What would be your take on that, Laurie Gottlieb?
Yeah, I think there's this misconception about therapy that people come into therapy, they talk about their childhood forever, and they never leave. And that's just not, I think, what therapy is. I think that therapy is certainly looking at how the past informs the present, because a lot of times, outside of people's awareness, they don't realize that there's another script running in the background. And they don't know about it. So, they're having an interaction with somebody in the present, but they're reacting as if they're reacting to someone in the past. Or they're interpreting somebody else's intention through the lens of something that happened in the past. And so to really get clear about sort of, what is old stuff and how does that inform some of the ways that, that are troubling you now. And then how can you separate that out? It's almost like people are wearing clothing that doesn't fit anymore. They're wearing this sort of childhood clothing and they're going through the world that way without realizing it. So that's important. And then it's really about creating a new present and really, making sure that you are functioning as somebody in the present so that you can create a different kind of future, so that you're not just sort of trapped in this old narrative that you're carrying around. I think that a lot of times people think, I'm coming to therapy to get to know myself. And I often say that you're coming to therapy in some ways to get to unknow yourself, to let go of those stories from the past that aren't true, but that, you told yourself back then, or you were told about yourself back then, that just don't apply to where you are right now.
Yes, obsolete, no longer apply, like the formerly overweight person who kind of still waddles or wears clothes that's too loose, or the child that wore braces and then never smiles fully as an adult. We see this kind of thing so often. So yes, it's beautiful, and to live in present time, to be able to see things clearly We all have what's called, what Carl Rogers called a stained glass window. We all look out at the world not from a pure window, but from the stained of the glass, from our values, our experiences, when we were born, where we were born, rich, poor, whatever it is. And that's how we interpret the world. And we have to look and see if our interpretations can be more objective, less subjective, would you say?
Yeah, I did a TED Talk recently about how we're all unreliable narrators. That, when people come in and they tell you a story, and every person does this, myself included, that it's told through the lens of our own perspective. And so the reason that people are stuck is because they're operating with a faulty narrative. And what I help people to do is to edit their stories so that, the reason they can't move forward to the next chapter, the reason the protagonist is going in circles instead of moving forward is because there's something wrong with the narrative. There's something faulty about the narrative because we are leaving things out. We're emphasizing certain things, minimizing other things. Who are the minor characters? Who are the major characters? Who are the heroes and the villains of the story? It's all mixed up. And so, I help people to sort of rewrite their stories so that they're coherent with the present and they're not kind of enmeshed in some old narrative that just isn't accurate.
Could you give an example of rewriting one's own story?
I think every single patient, and maybe you should talk to someone, goes through that process where they all come in and say, here's what's happening. John, the first person you meet who comes in and says, I have insomnia and, everybody is, stressing me out and all of this. Well, his story ends up, I don't want to give it away, ends up being wildly different from that.
Yes.
Charlotte's story, she's this young woman who keeps sort of dating the wrong people and says, I can't find a guy who wants to commit and, all of these things. And it turns out, she has radar for the people who are going to hurt her. And so it's not that all, there's no great guy out there. It's that she keeps choosing the ones who are from day one are going to disappoint her. So
because
these
it's
stories,
familiar, right, Laurie?
Yes, it's familiar, right? Right. And so that's the thing is that, this is why change is really hard, is because with change comes loss. And what we lose, even if it's positive change, this is why people say, I know I need to make this change. And yet they have so much trouble doing it, even though they know it will be good for them, because with change comes loss of the familiar. Sometimes we are more comfortable staying in an unpleasant or even miserable situation because we know it, the devil right? As opposed to going into something new, which requires us to tolerate uncertainty. And humans in general don't do well with uncertainty, or we think we're not going to do well with uncertainty. We actually do quite well with it, but we are so worried about trying something where we are going outside of our comfort zone that we would rather stay in the comfortable place that's miserable than go into the discomfort of something new that might be better.
The fear of the uncertainty, and yet that is human, because we need to make sense of the world and feel some sense of stability and understanding. But yet, I do think that's right, that we actually have done quite well with uncertainty. Just stay in the day, live one day at a time, stay grounded, stay in present time. And if you are triggered, look at those triggers as trailheads and, what happened? What just bothered me so much? And I don't want to react. I want to think and respond. So to start asking ourselves smart questions, I think.
Well, right. I think people are so afraid of discomfort. They're so afraid of feeling anxious or feeling sad or, whatever they're feeling, even envy. I always tell people, follow your envy. It tells you what you want. It's giving you some information about your desire that you have tamped down. And so I think even, with anxiety or sadness, people think, those are negative feelings. There's no such thing as a negative feeling. Our feelings are useful. Our feelings are like a compass. They tell us what we need. And if you don't listen to your feelings, it's not like they're going to go away. If you try to pretend they're not there, you try to stuff them down, they're still there. And in fact, they come out in other ways. They come out in too much food or too much alcohol or an inability to sleep or a short-temperedness, a stuckness, whatever it is, it's going to come out, or that mindless scrolling through the internet, right? A colleague of mine said that the internet was the most effective non-prescription painkiller out there, right? Mm-hmm. So that's how we numb our feelings. But the fact is, they're still there, and you're not using them to your benefit. You're not getting the information. What is this telling me? Why am I anxious? And, this is telling me about something that is not working out. Why am I angry? This is telling me about something that's not okay with me, right? It's really important that we use this great instrument that we have, which is our feelings, to help guide us in the right direction.
And when we try to close ourselves off to so-called negative feelings, we close ourselves off to joy as well. And we numb ourselves and become automatons. And as you also talk about in your book, that we're easier to relate to when we share our truth, when we allow ourselves to be vulnerable. And people often believe the opposite. If I let you know who I really am, then you will dislike me. So let me hide behind this mask.
Right. And that just keeps people isolated. It's so hard to have meaningful connections when you aren't showing up, when you aren't revealing sort of, and I don't mean TMI, by the way. I don't mean sort of too much information.
Oh, yeah.
Haphazardly. What I mean is just being authentic. And also, being able to, when we talk about vulnerability is, I think, very specific. It's about really taking off the mask with somebody who matters to you. It's not telling the stranger somewhere. It's not telling someone on social media something. It's sitting down face to face with a person who is important to you, and being able to reveal the truth of who you are, and being able to trust that person. It's choose your audience. And those are such deep, rich relationships that people form when they start to do that. It's like they've been going through relationship in black and white, and now all of a sudden their relationships are in color. And we see that so much. I have this new podcast.
Yes.
It's called Dear Therapists. And it kind of, what I'm trying to do is democratize therapy with all the things I do. I have this weekly column in The Atlantic. I did that TED Talk. I wrote, Maybe You Should Talk to Someone. And in this new podcast, it's doing what I do, and Maybe You Should Talk to Someone, but in the span of an hour, right? So it's me and my co-therapist, Guy Winch, and we bring the people write us letters, and you hear how therapists sort of talk about everyday dilemmas, and then we do kind of a session with the person. And so you hear what that sounds like. How do you move someone from a place of stuckness where they wrote in to a new place? And what we love about it is that at the end, we give them actionable homework, and that they have 1 week to try it. And then they come back and they tell us how it went, what worked, what didn't, and what we all can learn from it. And I love that piece because, it's not just like in my advice column, which, is I hope is useful to people. I get to hear what happened later on because the person usually writes to me and says, oh, thank you, this worked out. Here's what happened. But here the listener gets to hear, here's what happened when I had that conversation with my mother. Here's what happened when I talked to my partner about this. Here's what happened when I did this thing differently. And I think it's something that people can apply even if they don't have that same situation in their own lives. I think there's always something that they can take from the show that applies to their own lives. So I hope that through the book, through the podcast, through the column, through the TED Talk, that people are able to apply these things to their own lives and hopefully start to get curious about their own emotional health and really prioritize it.
Curiosity, that is so important. So, and Lori Gottlieb, author of Maybe You Should Talk to Someone, and what we're looking at here is choose your audience. And because we've all been taught to do this presentation management, positive impression management, we isolate, we don't tell our truth, and then we have this thing, you don't use this term in your book, but the terminal uniqueness, that we're the only ones that have this problem because I know what's going on in my insides, but I only know what's going on in the rest of the world from their outsides. So it's comparing apples and oranges in the first place.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that phrase. I think that so captures the experience of, of feeling like nobody else knows how you
Right.
feel. Nobody else could possibly relate. And I think that, and maybe you should talk to someone, the reason I wanted to bring all these stories out was because all of a sudden people are saying, wow, I thought I was the only one. And now they're looking at these stories and saying, oh, that's me, or I do that, or I feel that way, or I've experienced something like that. And there's something so transformative about feeling connected to the human condition as opposed to feeling shame around it.
Oh, that's beautiful. We all are so hardwired for a connection, and so many of us have such a core of shame from this terminal uniqueness, whatever you want to call it. So 2 things, we only have a couple of minutes. How do we access, besides reading your book, maybe you should talk to someone, Laurie Gottlieb, Gottlieb. How do we access your podcast?
Anywhere you listen to podcasts, Apple Podcasts, iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, wherever you listen. It's called Dear Therapists, plural.
Dear Therapist, yes. Dear Therapist. Also, will you let people know what it's like to have ABC bought the rights to your book and Eva Longoria is playing you?
I don't know if she's playing me. She's producing. She's producing.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so a story, a media story that people will know and understand you, about your life and your patients' lives.
Well,
that is so huge.
Yeah, I'm really glad that we're moving it to television, because I feel like there's, again, another way to kind of normalize the human condition. And also, I talk in the book about sort of the ridiculous of the human condition, that we're so hard on ourselves. We take ourselves so seriously, and we need to take our lives seriously. But I think sometimes we forget to laugh at ourselves, that human beings are ridiculous. And, if we could just, really have more compassion for ourselves, if we could, just really understand that we say one thing, we do another thing, we go in all kinds of directions. That is just part of being human. And I think in the TV series, it's really important to me that it's a show that's not just about, it's not a show about a therapist or therapy. It's a show about humans who happen to be therapists. So and that distinction might sound like splitting hairs, but I think it's really important that it's just about people. And yes, they happen to be therapists, and yes, these people happen to be therapy clients, but they're just people. And I think the therapy world is a great forum to be able to get into these people's lives in a different way that maybe we haven't seen before.
And to really feel that connection person to person. And I love what you said about idiot versus the wise.
Compassion, yeah.
Compassion, right. And I say to my clients, patients, audience members, that in my book is called merged support.
I always say to people when I'm giving talks, I'll say to the audience, who's the person that you talk to most in the course of your life? Show of hands. And I'll say, is it your partner? Lots of hands go up. Is it your parent? Is it your sibling? Is it your best friend? Whatever it is. And lots of hands. But you know what? The person we talk to most in the course of our lives is ourselves. And what we say isn't always kind or true or helpful. We are so critical of ourselves. We are so hard on ourselves. And we think that if I have compassion for myself, I won't hold myself accountable. Well, that's not true. Self-flagellation does not help you move forward, because what it does is it creates shame. And when we are feeling bathed in shame, we do not move forward. Self-compassion says, okay, I'm human and I'm going to hold myself accountable for this, but in a kind way.
Lori Gottlieb, on that note, thank you so much for this interview. And Lori Gottlieb, maybe you should talk to someone. Also, just go to TED Talks, go to your podcast, Dear Therapist. you will find Laurie Gottlieb, and you may watch her on TV, played by someone else, of course. Thank you again, Laurie.
Thank you so much for having me.
This is Dr. Duffy Spencer saying goodbye for now and wishing you great relationships.